In South Africa's golden age of tennis, one name stood above the rest: Bob Hewitt. A Grand Slam champion turned celebrated coach, trusted by parents and idolized by young players. But behind the polished smile and trophies lay a secret so dark it would shatter lives and redefine his legacy forever. In the quiet suburbs of Johannesburg in the late 1970s, tennis was more than a sport. It was a pathway to opportunity. South Africa, isolated from much of the world due to apartheid, still prized international recognition wherever it could find it. And in that world, few figures shone brighter than Bob Hewitt. A former Grand Slam doubles champion, Hewitt had built a reputation that carried both prestige and influence. To parents and young players alike, having him as a coach seemed like the ultimate chance. He was a man who had won Wimbledon, who'd played on the grandest courts, and who appeared to offer a bridge between local ambition and global success. When Hewitt moved into coaching, families lined up to have their children train with him. His wife, Gail, herself part of tennis circles, often joined him during practice sessions, reinforcing the image of a respectable, family-oriented mentor. He coached both boys and girls, but his particular focus was on young female players, often teenagers, some barely into their teens, who dreamed of turning professional one day. Parents trusted him. They dropped their daughters off at practice, confident they were leaving them in the care of someone who not only understood the sport, but embodied its ideals. In the world of South African tennis, Bob Hewitt was untouchable. His status gave him access, and his authority created silence around him. To the public, he was a champion who'd chosen to give back by training the next generation. But behind that image, there were moments his students didn't forget. Small things at first that didn't make sense, glances that lingered, words that made them uncomfortable, situations that crossed boundaries but were brushed off in confusion. These girls were young, often shy, raised to respect their elders and listen to their coaches. Hewitt used that trust carefully, inch by inch, blurring lines between mentorship and manipulation. It often started with extra attention. He singled out certain girls for special lessons, giving them more practice time or rides home after sessions. To their parents, it seemed like a sign of belief. He saw potential in their daughters. To the girls, it was confusing. His manner could shift quickly from encouraging to personal. He praised their appearance, joked in ways that felt wrong, but always under the cover of being their coach. In an era when conversations about sexual misconduct were rarely had, and when respect for authority often outweighed intuition, the warning signs went unspoken. Some of these sessions took place at his home. His house became an extension of the court, a place where the line between personal and professional blurred completely. When other players weren't around, his tone changed. What he called motivation often became invasive. A misplaced hand on a shoulder or a back, a hug that lingered, comments that veered into personal territory. Each act was subtle enough to confuse a child's understanding of right and wrong, wrapped in the authority of a man everyone said they could trust. The girls didn't know how to respond. Some withdrew from tennis entirely, unsure how to explain their discomfort to parents who idolized their coach. Others stayed silent for fear of being disbelieved or blamed. They carried the memories quietly, often convincing themselves they had misunderstood. In the 1970s and 80s, conversations about sexual boundaries between coaches and students were nearly non-existent. The culture around sports, especially women's sports, was built on discipline, respect, and silence. Over time, rumors floated through the tennis community. Some parents mentioned feeling uneasy about the way Hewitt interacted with their daughters, but without proof or clear language to describe it. The whispers never became accusations. The few who tried to raise questions found themselves facing resistance. Who would believe that a world-renowned champion, a man with a clean public record, could be capable of such behavior? In small, tight-knit sports circles, reputation often outweighed reality. Hewitt's charm was part of his shield. He could be warm and disarming, a man who smiled easily and spoke with authority. He was used to attention and admiration, and he knew how to maintain it. The image of the accomplished athlete, husband, and father deflected suspicion. Those around him, students, colleagues, even other coaches, accepted the surface version of who he was. And for years, that image went unchallenged. But for the girls he coached, the memories didn't fade. As they grew older, what once felt confusing began to make sense. The moments they had tried to rationalize as harmless became clearer in adulthood. Some of them realized they weren't alone, that others had experienced the same things under Hewitt's supervision. The sense of betrayal deepened as they understood the pattern. What had felt like isolated incidents were in fact parts of a calculated system built on power and control. The environment of tennis helped him. The sport demanded long hours of practice, often in private or semi-private settings. The physical nature of coaching, demonstrating technique, correcting posture, adjusting movement, gave him easy cover. He used his position to normalize inappropriate behavior, presenting it as part of his teaching method. Many girls didn't even realize at the time that what was happening was abuse. They were taught to push through discomfort, to trust their coach, to believe that success required sacrifice. In the years that followed, Hewitt's career continued. Even as he aged out of professional play, his name remained respected. He appeared in tennis circles across South Africa, occasionally abroad, still attached to his legacy as a doubles champion. The women he had hurt tried to move on, each in their own way. Some avoided the sport entirely. Others carried quiet shame, never telling anyone. The experiences were too difficult to explain, especially when the man involved was someone universally admired. For decades, the story stayed hidden beneath layers of silence. By the time the truth began to surface, many of those girls were adults with families of their own. Speaking out meant revisiting years of pain and confronting not only their past, but a society that often dismissed such claims. Yet, something began to shift. Conversations around abuse and accountability, especially in sports, were becoming more public. Across the world, survivors were starting to find their voices. And in South Africa, the name Bob Hewitt began to reappear not as a symbol of tennis greatness, but as a question that demanded answers. As one woman came forward, others followed. Each had her own account, her own memories of how the man who was supposed to guide them toward success had crossed the line in ways they couldn't understand as children. Their stories were strikingly similar, private lessons that turned personal, words that became threats, and the deep, lingering impact of betrayal. It was no longer possible to dismiss them as misunderstandings or exaggerations. When those stories reached the public, they shook the image of the once revered tennis champion. The details painted a portrait of manipulation that had gone unchecked for years. What once had been whispered behind closed doors was now being spoken out loud, recorded, and taken seriously. The trust that had protected Hewitt for decades began to crumble, replaced by a growing recognition that these women had been carrying the truth all along. By then, the world around him had changed. The culture of silence that once shielded powerful men in sports and entertainment was weakening. Reporters started digging. Courts began listening. And for the first time, Bob Hewitt, the champion, the coach, the family man, was about to face something he had long escaped: accountability. When the first allegations against Bob Hewitt surfaced, they began quietly. Former students who had trained under him in the 1970s and 80s started to talk, sharing memories that had lingered for decades. For years, they had doubted themselves, wondering if what happened had been abuse or a misunderstanding. But when they compared their experiences, the similarities were undeniable. The first to come forward publicly was Heather Crow. She had been a teenager when Hewitt began singling her out for extra lessons, telling her she was talented and destined for greatness. His attention, at first flattering, soon became something darker. Crow described how he isolated her, manipulated her trust, and eventually assaulted her. Coming forward as an adult wasn't easy, but silence had become unbearable. Her story broke a dam that others had been holding back for years. Soon after, Sue Ellen Sheehan and Teresa Tolkien shared their own accounts. They too had been young players under Hewitt's guidance. Each woman described a pattern: private sessions that turned personal, praise mixed with intimidation, and a deep sense of confusion that kept them quiet for decades. The details were consistent enough to form a clear pattern of grooming and control. They weren't connected at the time of their abuse, yet their experiences mirrored each other almost exactly. By then, Hewitt was in his 70s, living quietly on a farm in the Eastern Cape. When reporters found him, he dismissed the allegations as false, claiming his relationships with students had been professional. He said the women were seeking attention. But his denials only drew more scrutiny. The Sunday Times published detailed interviews, and the public began to take notice. Some still refused to believe that a sports hero could be guilty of such crimes. Others saw in the women's stories the painful truth that power often shields wrongdoing. The South African National Prosecuting Authority soon launched an investigation. It was a difficult case. There was no physical evidence, and the incidents were decades old. But the consistency of the testimonies gave the case weight. Investigators interviewed former students, colleagues, and parents. Some defended Hewitt as strict but fair. Others admitted they had once felt uneasy about his behavior. The picture that emerged was of a man who used authority and charm to gain access to young girls, hiding predatory behavior behind the image of a trusted coach. The scandal quickly reached international tennis circles. Hewitt had been inducted into the International Tennis Hall of Fame in 1992, but as the allegations gained traction, pressure mounted. By 2012, his membership was suspended. Later, he was expelled altogether. The gesture couldn't undo what had happened, but it was a public acknowledgement that his reputation could no longer protect him. The case exposed how easily power and prestige could silence victims. In the 1970s and 80s, coaches held enormous authority over young athletes. Parents placed complete trust in them, and speaking out meant risking shame, disbelief, or the end of a budding career. For the survivors, coming forward decades later required immense courage. Each woman faced interrogation, skepticism, and public scrutiny. They were forced to relive their trauma in excruciating detail, but they persisted because they wanted the truth recognized. Their accounts showed how Hewitt's abuse followed a calculated pattern. He began by praising talent, then offering extra coaching sessions. He blurred emotional lines, convincing girls that trust and closeness were part of improving their game. When they resisted, he used guilt or threats, suggesting their tennis careers depended on obedience. It was classic grooming, disguised as mentorship, protected by reputation, and reinforced by silence. Hewitt's lawyers built their defense around time and memory. They argued that too much time had passed for reliable testimony, that recollections could have blurred, and that the accusations were motivated by publicity or bitterness. But the survivors' stories were detailed, consistent, and corroborated by circumstantial evidence. They described the same patterns of behavior, the same settings, and the same emotional manipulation. Their courage made it impossible to dismiss them as fabrications. As the investigation unfolded, the case became part of a larger conversation about sexual abuse in sports. Around the world, similar scandals were being exposed. The power imbalance between coaches and young athletes was under the microscope. In South Africa, Hewitt's case forced sports institutions to confront their lack of oversight and their culture of silence. It also opened a conversation about how society had long protected powerful men at the expense of vulnerable girls. Public opinion shifted gradually. At first, there was disbelief, especially among those who had admired Hewitt for decades. But as more information emerged, as journalists and prosecutors revealed the depth of the evidence, the tone changed. The focus turned to the women, their bravery, their persistence, and the years they spent living with secrets they never should have had to carry. Throughout the proceedings, the women stood firm. They endured lengthy questioning and defense strategies aimed at undermining their credibility. They faced online harassment and whispers from within the tennis community. Yet, despite everything, they refused to back down. What united them wasn't revenge. It was the belief that telling the truth mattered. They wanted acknowledgement, not fame. They wanted justice, not sympathy. Meanwhile, Hewitt remained unrepentant. He appeared before cameras, frail but defiant, maintaining his innocence. He portrayed himself as a victim of false memories and media bias, insisting that his students had misunderstood his actions. His tone carried the same confidence that had once shielded him, but the world was no longer the same. The old culture of silence that had once protected him had begun to crumble. By the time the case reached the High Court, it had become more than the story of a disgraced coach. It was a test of whether justice could still be found after decades of silence. Inside the courtroom, the survivors testified one by one. Their words were calm, deliberate, and painful. They described the details they had carried since childhood, the moments of fear, confusion, and betrayal. The judge listened intently, aware that this was not just about evidence, but about the credibility of voices long ignored. The hearings were emotional. Some of the women broke down as they described their experiences. Others spoke with steady voices, determined not to let him intimidate them again. Every word carried the weight of years lost to trauma and silence. For the first time, they had the chance to look him in the eye and tell the truth that had been buried for almost 40 years. The proceedings dragged on for months, with delays and legal maneuvering. But the survivors' testimonies remained the strongest part of the case. They spoke with precision and honesty, never exaggerating, never wavering. Their courage gave power to a story that had once been invisible. When the final witnesses finished, the courtroom fell into a tense quiet. Outside, the public waited for the outcome. The man who had once been celebrated for his athletic glory was now being defined by something else entirely: the damage he had caused and the trust he had destroyed. Bob Hewitt's name had once stood for triumph. Now, it represented a reckoning. After decades of silence, his past had finally caught up with him. The question that hung over the courtroom was no longer whether the women were telling the truth. It was whether the system would believe them and deliver justice after all these years. When the trial reached its final stage, the courtroom was tense. The testimonies had laid bare decades of hidden abuse, and the public followed every development closely. Bob Hewitt sat quietly through most of the proceedings, expressionless, occasionally shaking his head as witnesses spoke. Once a man celebrated for his achievements, he was now a symbol of betrayal and disgrace. The charges were serious: 2 counts of rape and 1 of sexual assault, all involving young girls he had coached in the 1980s. The women, now in their 40s and 50s, had waited a lifetime for this moment. The judge listened carefully to every word. The evidence was largely testimonial, but the consistency across each account was undeniable. The survivors didn't know one another at the time of the abuse, yet their stories matched in tone, detail, and sequence. They described the same methods of grooming, the same manipulation, and the same chilling threats that kept them silent. The defense attempted to cast doubt, arguing that memory fades and that accusations made decades later could not be trusted. But the women's memories were sharp where it mattered most: the fear, the voice of authority, the feeling of being trapped. Hewitt's demeanor alternated between dismissive and weary. He denied the accusations, insisting he had never harmed anyone and that he had been a strict but caring coach. He spoke of his long career, his family, and his fading health, hoping for sympathy. But the court saw through it. His fame, once an armor, now worked against him. The very reputation that gave him access to young players had also allowed him to act without question. The judge made it clear that prestige could not erase accountability. When the verdict was delivered in March 2015, the room was silent. The judge found Bob Hewitt guilty on all counts: 2 rapes and 1 sexual assault. The decision was based not on physical evidence, but on the overwhelming credibility of the survivors' testimony. The judge commended their courage, acknowledging the difficulty of speaking out after so many years. He said their willingness to confront the past had exposed a predator who had hidden behind his fame for too long. For the women, it was a moment of both vindication and sorrow. Justice had finally arrived, but it had come after decades of silence and pain. A few months later, Hewitt returned to court for sentencing. He appeared frail, moving slowly, his once confident presence replaced by visible defeat. The court sentenced him to 6 years in prison. The judge called his actions a gross abuse of power and trust, saying that his crimes had left lasting scars on his victims. For the survivors, the sentence was not about punishment, it was about recognition. For the first time, someone in authority had said publicly that what happened to them was real and wrong. In the aftermath, reactions poured in from around the world. The tennis community expressed shock, but also a sense of responsibility. The International Tennis Hall of Fame formally expelled him, erasing his name from its records. Sports organizations across South Africa reviewed their policies on athlete safety, aware now that silence had once allowed a predator to thrive. The case became a reference point for how abuse of power could go unchecked when institutions looked away. For the women who had come forward, the verdict marked the end of a long and painful journey. They spoke about the toll it had taken, the sleepless nights, the anxiety, the fear of being judged or dismissed. Yet they also spoke about the relief of being heard. Their courage inspired others. In the months following the sentencing, more survivors from different fields began sharing their stories publicly. Hewitt's conviction had become part of a wider shift toward accountability, proving that even decades later, truth could still matter. Hewitt served part of his sentence at a correctional facility near Port Elizabeth. In 2019, after serving 3 years, he was released on parole. The decision was met with anger and disappointment. The women who had fought so hard for justice felt that the system had once again favored the powerful. They believed that 6 years had never been enough, and 3 behind bars felt like a small price for the harm he had caused. Still, they found solace in knowing his crimes were now public, his reputation permanently stained. The man once celebrated for his victories on the court was now remembered for what he had done off it. His release reignited discussion about how justice systems handle sexual crimes, especially those that come to light years later. Many argued that lenient sentences and early parole failed to reflect the lifelong trauma victims endure. But others saw the case as a victory in itself, a rare example of truth prevailing over status and time. It reminded the public that justice, even delayed, can still hold meaning. For those who had been his victims, closure came not from his imprisonment, but from reclaiming their voices. They spoke openly about their experiences, determined that no young athlete should face what they had. Their courage reshaped how South Africans talked about abuse, mentorship, and trust. The case exposed the hidden dangers that can exist behind authority and reminded everyone that silence often protects the wrong people. By the time Bob Hewitt faded from public life, his legacy was no longer measured by trophies or titles, but by the harm he had inflicted and the strength of those who stood against him. His story became a warning about the cost of unchecked power, the importance of believing survivors, and the possibility of truth surviving even after decades of silence. In 2012, a respected tennis umpire, known for her calm voice and steady hand on the court, was suddenly accused of a brutal crime, murdering her husband with a coffee mug. What began as a peaceful morning in Los Angeles unraveled into one of the most unexpected criminal cases in sports history. In the spring of 2012, Los Angeles police received a call that seemed routine. 70-year-old Alan Goodman, a retired attorney, was found dead inside his Woodland Hills home. His wife, 70-year-old Lois Goodman, had called friends to say she believed Alan had suffered a heart attack while she was out. Lois wasn't an ordinary name in her community. She was a well-known tennis umpire who had worked for decades at national and international tournaments, including the prestigious U.S. Open in New York. In the tennis world, she was respected, professional, and known for her calm authority on the court. Off the court, she was described as soft-spoken, polite, and focused on her career. To those who knew the couple, Lois and Alan seemed stable. They'd been married for more than 50 years, both in their 70s, and had built a quiet life together in Los Angeles. Alan, though retired, remained active in community activities and enjoyed time with friends. Lois spent most of her time traveling for tournaments or working local matches. Their friends described them as a normal, older couple who had their differences, but no visible hostility. When Alan was discovered dead, there was no immediate suspicion of foul play. His body was found in bed, partly covered by a blanket, with no sign of forced entry or struggle in the house. The first assessment by police was that Allen had died in his sleep. Lois told investigators she had been preparing for her trip to New York, where she was scheduled to officiate at the upcoming U.S. Open. She said she had checked on her husband earlier in the day and thought he was resting. When she couldn't reach him later, she asked a friend to go to the house. That friend was the one who found Allen's body. It might have ended there, but the coroner's report changed everything. The autopsy revealed Allen hadn't died of natural causes. He had suffered multiple blunt force injuries to his head. The pattern of wounds suggested he'd been struck several times with a hard, blunt object. Detectives were told that the object could have been something like a coffee mug. The shape of the cuts and bruises didn't fit a fall or accident. Suddenly, what had seemed like a quiet death of an elderly man became a homicide case. Detectives returned to the Goodman home. They looked again at the bedroom and found traces that didn't sit right with them. Some objects seemed out of place, and there were signs that the scene had been tidied up after the incident. Lois, by then, had already traveled to New York to prepare for her umpiring duties. Her trip, which had seemed natural before, now looked suspicious to investigators. Why had she left so soon after her husband's death? And why was she so quick to assume it was natural causes when the injuries told a different story? Police began piecing together the couple's last days. Neighbors recalled hearing nothing unusual, no arguments or loud noises. Friends mentioned that Lois had seemed tired and stressed from travel and work, but not angry or unstable. Yet detectives wondered if years of strain or resentment had built up quietly. They spoke with people close to the couple, trying to understand their relationship. Some described Allen as controlling. Others said Lois often deferred to him. But no one could point to any violent behavior or domestic fights. The case had no clear motive, only questions. As the investigation deepened, police examined phone records, credit card receipts, and travel details. They learned Lois had been in contact with friends the day Allen's body was found, calmly explaining that she thought he'd passed away peacefully. That calmness bothered investigators. They expected more shock, more emotion. When asked why she left for New York despite her husband's death, she reportedly said she believed there was nothing more she could do. By August 2012, nearly 4 months after Allen's death, detectives felt they had enough circumstantial evidence to act. They secured a warrant for Lois Goodman's arrest. What happened next became the defining moment of the case. On August 21st, Lois was in New York City, staying at a hotel, preparing for the start of the U.S. Open. She had her umpire's uniform laid out and her accreditation badge ready. Before she could leave for the courts, New York police and U.S. Marshals arrived at her door. She was handcuffed and taken into custody. The image of a 70-year-old tennis umpire being led away in handcuffs stunned the sports world. Lois Goodman, who had spent decades enforcing fairness on the court, was now accused of committing one of the most serious crimes imaginable, killing her husband. The arrest made national headlines. Broadcasters replayed footage of her officiating matches, her calm voice calling scores, contrasting it with the mugshot that followed. Prosecutors in Los Angeles said Lois had attacked her husband with a coffee mug during an argument, striking him repeatedly until he died. They claimed she then cleaned up the scene and left town to cover up what she had done. The theory was that she may have snapped after years of marital strain. Lois's lawyers immediately called the accusations absurd. They said there was no direct evidence linking her to the crime, no fingerprints, no DNA, and no witnesses. They emphasized her spotless record and the lack of motive. The case became a media storm. Reporters described Lois as calm but shaken during her arrest. She told them she was innocent and had loved her husband deeply. She was extradited back to Los Angeles, where she was formally charged with murder. Her bail was set high, and her family struggled to process what was happening. For months, Lois's name was everywhere, from sports networks to crime shows. The idea of a respected tennis umpire turned accused killer was too striking to ignore. Behind the headlines, though, the evidence began to show cracks. Investigators couldn't find the coffee mug that matched the alleged weapon description. They also couldn't establish a clear motive or timeline. Still, prosecutors moved forward, arguing that Lois's decision to travel right after her husband's death showed guilt. The defense countered that it showed only her commitment to her job and her belief that Alan had died naturally. As Lois awaited trial, the pressure grew. Her career was on hold, her reputation shattered, and her family divided by disbelief and fear. Yet through it all, she maintained her composure. In interviews, she said she was determined to clear her name and return to the sport she loved. By late 2012, months after her arrest, the case was at a crossroads. Detectives had built a story based on suspicion and timing, but the physical proof wasn't adding up. There were no witnesses, no confessions, and no weapon conclusively tied to her. The public watched closely as the investigation reached its most uncertain phase, a respected woman's life hanging on evidence that was, at best, unclear. And that's where the story stood for now, a shocking accusation, a fragile web of circumstantial clues, and a woman once trusted to uphold fairness, now fighting to prove her own innocence. The courtroom would become the next battleground, where the truth behind the death of Alan Goodman would finally begin to unfold. When Lois Goodman was brought back to Los Angeles, the media crowded every step she took. Cameras flashed as the 70-year-old umpire, dressed neatly in a simple sweater and slacks, was led into court. Her face was tired but composed. The woman who had once stood on tennis courts enforcing rules and keeping order now stood accused of murder. The courtroom was filled with reporters, curious spectators, and a few of Lois's supporters from the tennis community who refused to believe she was capable of such violence. Prosecutors painted a vivid picture for the judge. They claimed Lois had struck her husband, Alan Goodman, with a coffee mug during a heated argument, shattering the mug and leaving him with multiple head wounds. They argued that she had then cleaned the scene, covered him with a blanket, and left for New York, hoping to avoid suspicion. The narrative was simple but powerful, a wife who had finally snapped. They suggested the motive might have been resentment built up over years or frustration about something personal, though they could not specify what that motive actually was. The defense, led by attorney Allison Treasel, wasted no time challenging that theory. She told the court that Lois Goodman was being prosecuted based on guesswork, not facts. Treasel pointed out that police had no murder weapon, no eyewitnesses, and no DNA evidence linking Lois to her husband's death. There was also no financial motive, no history of domestic violence, and no signs of a struggle in the home. The prosecution story, she argued, was built entirely on assumptions. While Lois was being held, her life unraveled. She lost her assignments with tennis organizations. Her reputation in the sports world was shattered, and her home became the center of an active crime scene. Friends who had once celebrated her career were now afraid to be associated with her. A few, however, remained loyal. They described Lois as kind, disciplined, and incapable of violence. They said the accusation didn't fit the woman they knew, a professional who had built her entire life around fairness and self-control. Behind the scenes, investigators kept trying to connect the dots. They examined the Goodmans' finances, hoping to find a motive, such as insurance money or hidden debt. They found nothing unusual. They checked Lois's phone and email records, looking for signs of anger, arguments, or infidelity. Nothing. There were no signs that Lois had planned anything or even behaved oddly before Alan's death. Every lead that might have confirmed their theory seemed to fade away. Still, the prosecution stood by its timeline. They argued that Lois had likely struck Alan in the morning, cleaned the scene, and then calmly boarded her flight to New York. They said her calm tone when speaking to friends after his death was unnatural, proof that she was hiding something. The defense countered that Lois was simply composed by nature. The same calmness that made her a good umpire was now being misread as guilt. In interviews, people who had worked with her on the tennis circuit recalled her as strict but respectful, always in control of her emotions, even under pressure. A fellow umpire, who had known her for over 20 years, said, "I've seen Lois handle angry players, storms, long days, and impossible calls. She never loses her temper. The idea that she could beat someone to death is just beyond belief. The media, however, thrived on the contrast. They replayed old footage of Lois on the court, calling points in her steady voice, then cut to images of her in handcuffs. Headlines spoke of a tennis umpire's dark secret and the coffee mug murder. Talk shows speculated about the pressure of marriage and aging, about the hidden rage of someone used to control. The case had the perfect blend of mystery and contradiction, a public figure accused of private violence. While all this played out, Lois sat in jail for several days before being released on bond. Her friends and family helped raise the money. She returned home to a place that no longer felt familiar. The house had been searched repeatedly by police. Personal belongings were gone, evidence bags had replaced furniture, and the silence inside was heavy. Reporters waited outside, calling out questions every time she opened her door. Her defense team began re-examining the physical evidence. The biggest problem for prosecutors was that the alleged murder weapon, the coffee mug, was never found. Investigators collected several mugs from the house, but none showed blood or fingerprints that could tie Lois to the crime. The coroner's report stated that the cause of death was blunt force trauma, but the specific weapon couldn't be confirmed. The defense argued that without that link, the case could not stand. Then came another issue: timing. Prosecutors claimed Allen had been killed in the morning, but the coroner could not pinpoint the exact time of death. Some of the injuries could have occurred hours earlier, possibly from a fall or accident. Allen was an elderly man with health issues, including balance problems. The defense began exploring whether he might have fallen, hit his head, and died accidentally, a theory that fit the injuries just as well as the prosecution story. Treacle also highlighted how poorly the case had been handled at the start. When police first arrived at the Goodman home, they had treated it as a natural death. No one had secured the scene immediately or taken forensic photos before the body was moved. Valuable evidence may have been lost in those first few hours. What began as a routine death investigation had suddenly been turned into a murder case based on a reinterpreted autopsy, not solid, original evidence. Lois's arrest in New York now seemed even more extreme in that light. The defense argued that it was unnecessary and humiliating. They said the police could have easily contacted her to return to Los Angeles for questioning instead of arresting her in front of colleagues and the media. That decision, they claimed, turned a weak case into a public spectacle. As the months went on, the prosecution struggled to keep the case alive. They reviewed every inch of evidence again, but found nothing new. Detectives couldn't establish a solid motive or reconstruct a convincing timeline. Even the coroner's findings were questioned by experts brought in by the defense, who said the injuries were not consistent with an intentional beating, but possibly with a fall. Despite the weak evidence, the emotional weight of the accusation was heavy. For Lois, the hardest part was being seen as a murderer before ever standing trial. Her years of professionalism meant little in the face of suspicion. Tennis associations quietly distanced themselves. She stopped watching the sport altogether, unable to bear seeing the matches she once officiated. Meanwhile, her lawyers filed motions to dismiss the case, arguing that prosecutors were holding her without sufficient evidence. Reporters began to notice the holes too. Some newspapers started questioning whether the authorities had rushed to judgment. One legal analyst said on air, "If this case goes to trial, the defense will have a field day. There's no murder weapon, no motive, no eyewitness, and the timeline is full of gaps." Behind closed doors, prosecutors debated how to move forward. The case had drawn massive attention, and dropping it could make them look weak. But continuing without strong evidence risked humiliation in court. The decision weighed heavily. Detectives who had spent months on the case were frustrated. They had believed in their theory that Lois had snapped, that the injuries couldn't have been accidental. Yet, without proof, belief wasn't enough. For Lois, each court appearance was another test of endurance. She arrived quietly, often with her attorney at her side, and said little. Her focus was on surviving the process, one hearing at a time. Her calmness once used against her, became her shield. Those close to her said she had moments of deep despair, but never anger. She wanted the truth to come out, even if it took time. By late autumn, nearly 7 months after Allen's death, the case was beginning to crumble. The media, once fascinated by the tennis umpire murder, started losing interest as the sensational story failed to produce new developments. Behind the headlines, Lois's lawyers continued pushing for dismissal, insisting that no jury could convict her based on the evidence presented. The case had started as a mystery and had become a question of credibility, not only of Lois Goodman, but of the entire investigation. What began as a shocking accusation was slowly turning into a legal puzzle with missing pieces. And with each passing week, the confidence of the prosecution faded. But for Lois, her freedom was still uncertain. The charges had not yet been dropped, and the possibility of a trial still hung over her like a shadow. The next step would determine everything, whether she would face a jury and risk her future, or whether the case that had destroyed her reputation would finally fall apart under its own weight. By November 2012, 7 months after Allen Goodman's death, the case that once seemed certain to prosecutors had nearly collapsed. What began as a dramatic accusation had turned into a lesson in how fragile a criminal case can be when built on weak evidence. The prosecution had promised a story of rage and violence, but as each detail was examined, it fell apart. The evidence was circumstantial, the timeline inconsistent, and the supposed murder weapon was missing. At every hearing, the defense pressed harder, exposing gaps that could no longer be ignored. Inside the Los Angeles courtroom, the atmosphere shifted. Reporters, who had once crowded the seats, now appeared less frequently. The grand narrative of a respected tennis umpire turned killer no longer held up under scrutiny. Even the prosecutors seemed more cautious when addressing the court. The initial confidence had given way to quiet hesitation. They still claimed that Lois Goodman had murdered her husband with a coffee mug, but they could no longer prove it. Lois sat through each session, silent and steady. She had aged visibly in just a few months, her posture a little more slumped, her voice quieter. Yet her composure remained intact. She was determined to see the process through, no matter how long it took. Her attorney, Allison Treasel, filed another motion to have the case dismissed, this time armed with statements from forensic experts who contradicted the prosecution's entire theory. Those experts reviewed the autopsy and found that Allen Goodman's injuries were not unique to blunt force trauma caused by a weapon. They could also have come from a fall, possibly downstairs or onto furniture. Allen had medical issues, including poor balance and dizziness. The bruising patterns, according to one expert, could have developed from hitting a hard surface rather than from being struck by someone else. Without a weapon, without fingerprints, and without witnesses, there was no definitive proof that anyone had killed him. The prosecutor's office requested more time to review new evidence, but by then, their case had run out of energy. Investigators who had worked on it privately admitted they could not move forward with confidence. There was no confession, no direct link to Lois, and no indication that she had tried to flee or destroy evidence. She had cooperated from the beginning, answering every question and submitting to every test. What had once looked suspicious, the decision to leave for New York after Allen's death, now appeared simply like a misunderstanding. She believed her husband had died of natural causes, and she left for work as planned. In late November, the district attorney's office made the decision that would end the ordeal. They formally announced that all charges against Lois Goodman were being dropped due to insufficient evidence. The announcement came quietly, with no grand press conference or statement of regret. The court clerk read the motion to dismiss, and just like that, the murder case that had drawn national headlines was over. When Lois heard the decision, she broke her silence. She thanked her lawyer, her remaining supporters, and said simply that she was relieved to have her life back. Her tone was calm, but carried the weight of months of fear and humiliation. The judge acknowledged her composure throughout the process and confirmed that she was free to go. Reporters outside the courthouse tried to get her to comment, but she declined, saying only that she had been through hell and wanted to go home. Her attorney spoke on her behalf, criticizing the investigation for what she called a rush to judgment. She pointed out how the police had treated a natural death as a homicide based on one interpretation of an autopsy report, and how the arrest in New York had been unnecessary. This woman was handcuffed and publicly humiliated without a single piece of physical evidence against her, Treacle told reporters. It should never have happened. The dismissal marked the end of the legal process, but for Lois, the damage was lasting. Her career as a tennis umpire was effectively over. Though she was cleared, the stain of the accusation followed her. Many in the tennis community felt sympathy for her, but also recognized that returning to the court after such publicity would be nearly impossible. She retreated from public life, choosing privacy over attention. Friends who stayed in touch said she was deeply changed, quieter, cautious about who she trusted, and unwilling to revisit those months in conversation. The case itself became an example in legal discussions about circumstantial evidence. Law students studied it as a cautionary tale of what can happen when investigators build a narrative before having proof. It raised questions about how quickly the justice system can turn suspicion into accusation, and how difficult it is for an ordinary person to fight back once labeled a suspect. There were no apologies from the authorities, only a quiet acknowledgement that the evidence had never reached the standard required for prosecution. The story of Lois Goodman didn't end with a confession, conviction, or sentencing. There was no killer brought to justice because, in the end, there was no proven crime. Alan Goodman's death was officially left as an unresolved incident, possibly accidental. The man once thought to have been murdered may have died from a simple fall, the kind that happens every day among older adults. The tragedy was compounded by what followed, the suspicion that tore apart a woman's life and the public judgment that came long before any facts were confirmed. In interviews years later, people close to Lois described her as trying to rebuild a quiet life, away from the cameras and the courts. She occasionally spoke about how fragile reputation can be and how easily an accusation can become a conviction in the court of public opinion. Once they say you did it, she told one friend, you can never really go back to who you were before. The theme of her story is not one of guilt or innocence alone, but of how justice can be distorted when certainty is replaced by assumption. The turning point, the moment of her arrest at the U.S. Open, remained a symbol of how quickly everything can change. One morning, she was a respected umpire preparing for a major tournament. By that afternoon, she was the face of a murder headline that would follow her for the rest of her life. For Lois Goodman, freedom eventually came, but so did a lasting awareness of how vulnerable even the most disciplined, law-abiding person can be when the system gets it wrong. Her case became not just a story about a death in Los Angeles, but about the thin line between suspicion and proof, and how, for one woman, that line nearly cost her everything. In 1985, a teenage prodigy shocked the world by winning Wimbledon. Decades later, that same champion stood in a London courtroom accused of hiding millions. What happened to Boris Becker, the golden boy who conquered tennis but lost everything to greed, pride, and the secrets he thought he could keep? In the world of sports, few names shone brighter than Boris Becker, a German tennis prodigy who stormed into global fame at just 17. He stunned the world in 1985 by winning Wimbledon, the youngest male champion in history. His aggressive serves, diving volleys, and fearless energy made him a legend on and off the court. Over the years, Becker earned 6 Grand Slam titles, millions in prize money, and lucrative endorsement deals. He was the pride of Germany, an icon of athletic brilliance and confidence. But behind the trophies and fame, another story was slowly unfolding. A story of mismanagement, financial ruin, and ultimately criminal conviction. By his mid-50s, Boris Becker's life had changed dramatically. After retirement, he divided his time between London and his hometown of Leymen, Germany. Becker was no longer the unstoppable athlete. Instead, he reinvented himself as a commentator, coach, and businessman. He even served as coach to Novak Djokovic, helping the Serbian player win multiple major titles. Outwardly, he lived a glamorous life, attending high-profile events, giving motivational talks, and appearing on television. But financial trouble was already knocking on his door. Years of expensive living, failed business ventures, and costly divorces had drained much of his fortune. Reports suggested that he owed millions in debts, and his assets were tied up in complicated investments. The first public sign of Becker's troubles came in 2017, when a London court declared him bankrupt. The case was initiated by Arbuthnot Latham, a private bank that claimed Becker owed them more than £3 million. The declaration came as a shock to fans who still pictured him as a wealthy sports legend. Yet, behind the scenes, Becker's financial situation was far worse than anyone imagined. Despite his earnings from tennis, sponsorships, and appearances, his money had been poorly managed. He had invested in risky ventures, faced large tax bills, and gone through expensive personal disputes. In his defense, Becker said he was confident the issue would be resolved soon. But it was only the beginning of a long and painful unraveling. Once a person is declared bankrupt in the United Kingdom, they must disclose all assets and cooperate with financial authorities. Becker was required to reveal details of his bank accounts, properties, and personal valuables to ensure that his creditors could recover what they were owed. The Insolvency Service, a government body that oversees such matters, took charge of investigating his finances. It was here that the story began to take a darker turn. Becker was accused of failing to fully disclose his assets, something that, under UK law, is a serious criminal offense. Over the following months, investigators discovered inconsistencies in Becker's declarations. Certain bank accounts were missing from his reports, and several transactions appeared suspicious. They found evidence that large sums had been transferred from his main accounts to others connected to his family members and associates. There were also concerns about his property holdings, including an apartment in Lehman, Germany, and shares in a technology firm that he hadn't disclosed. Even some of his famous tennis trophies, Wimbledon cups, and other memorabilia were reportedly unaccounted for. These discoveries raised questions about whether Becker was deliberately hiding his wealth. At this stage, the case was still under review, and Becker continued to live in London, often seen at sporting events and television appearances. He denied any wrongdoing, insisting that he was cooperating fully and that any mistakes were unintentional. His lawyers argued that he was confused by the complexity of the bankruptcy process and relied heavily on financial advisors. However, as the investigation deepened, the evidence painted a different picture. The Insolvency Service accused him of concealing hundreds of thousands of pounds and withholding crucial information. The matter soon moved from being a financial dispute to a criminal case. Becker's personal life also became part of the public conversation. He was divorced from his first wife, Barbara Becker, with whom he had 2 sons. He later married Dutch model Charlie Lily Becker, and they had a son together before separating. Both relationships had been costly, involving settlements and property divisions. Around this time, media outlets also revisited earlier controversies from Becker's past, affairs, tax issues in Germany, and public arguments. His image as the clean-cut champion began to fade, replaced by that of a troubled celebrity trying to hold on to his legacy. The legal process continued for several years as investigators built a detailed case. By 2021, the evidence was ready to be presented in court. Becker, then 54 years old, was charged with multiple offenses under the Insolvency Act. The charges included concealing assets, removing property, and failing to disclose bank accounts. Each charge represented a separate act of dishonesty that, according to prosecutors, showed a deliberate attempt to keep creditors from accessing his money. The court case took place at Southwark Crown Court in London, a venue known for handling complex financial crimes. It was a striking fall from grace for a man once cheered by crowds on the world's greatest tennis courts. The prosecution, led by Rebecca Chowkley, portrayed Becker as someone who had lived beyond his means and tried to manipulate the system when faced with bankruptcy. She argued that his lifestyle, combined with his efforts to hide money, showed he was acting intentionally to protect his wealth. He was not a man overwhelmed by confusion, she said in court. He was a man who thought he could get away with it. Becker's defense, handled by senior barrister Jonathan Laidlaw, took a very different approach. They described Becker as overwhelmed and emotionally drained, a man who had trusted advisors, but didn't grasp the full legal consequences of his actions. Laidlaw argued that Becker wasn't trying to deceive anyone, but was disorganized and under immense stress. He reminded the court of Becker's long career, the pressures of fame, and his struggles after retirement. He emphasized that Becker's bankruptcy didn't come from greed or arrogance, but from poor financial management and personal turmoil. As the trial progressed, witnesses described the intricate web of accounts and transactions connected to Becker. Bank records showed transfers totaling hundreds of thousands of pounds, including payments to his ex-wife Lily and other family members. Investigators also pointed out missing documents, such as records for certain properties and trophies. Some of these trophies were later discovered during searches, but others were still missing, fueling speculation about whether they had been sold or hidden. Throughout the proceedings, Becker maintained a calm demeanor. He often appeared in court wearing a suit, greeting photographers politely. But those who watched him closely noticed the strain. He had been a global icon, celebrated for his courage on the court, now standing accused of dishonesty in a British courtroom. The story fascinated the media in both the UK and Germany. Newspapers ran headlines about the fall of a legend, and documentaries began exploring how a champion could lose control of his finances so completely. The case was no longer just about money. It was about integrity, reputation, and personal downfall. Becker's name, once associated with Wimbledon victories, was now linked to deceit and financial misconduct. And while the trial was far from over, it was clear that the evidence was mounting against him. The prosecution's narrative was strong, and the defense could only hope to convince the jury that Becker's errors were born from confusion, not criminal intent. By the time the trial resumed in London, Boris Becker's story had become a national talking point in both the United Kingdom and Germany. The man once praised for his athletic brilliance was now sitting in a courtroom facing accusations of dishonesty, concealment, and manipulation of assets. So the Crown Court became the stage where his life was dissected, every transaction and decision laid bare. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal experts, and curious members of the public who wanted to witness how a global sports icon had come to this point. The proceedings, while technical and detailed, revealed more about Becker's financial chaos than anyone had previously known. At the center of the prosecution's case was the claim that Becker had hidden assets and failed to disclose important financial information during his bankruptcy proceedings. Prosecutor Rebecca Chowkley presented evidence showing how, in the months and years following the bankruptcy declaration in 2017, Becker had moved large amounts of money out of his main accounts. She explained that these transfers, totaling hundreds of thousands of pounds, were made to people close to him, including family members. Records showed that more than £390,000 had been transferred to his ex-wife Charlie Lily Becker and to another woman, Angela Ermakova, the mother of one of his children. These transactions raised serious doubts about Becker's honesty in complying with his bankruptcy obligations. The prosecution also detailed a complex web of assets Becker failed to disclose. He was accused of not revealing ownership of a property in Lehman, his hometown in Germany, and of hiding shares in a technology company called Breaking Data Corp, which owned the sports news platform SportLobster. In addition, he was accused of concealing a loan of €825,000 from a German businessman. The court heard that Becker's financial statements were incomplete, vague, and inconsistent, making it difficult for his bankruptcy trustees to identify what he still owned and what could be sold to pay off creditors. To the prosecution, this was no coincidence. They argued that Becker, despite his public image of confusion and distress, had been systematically moving money and hiding assets. The defense maintained a very different picture. Jonathan Laidlaw, Becker's lead barrister, spoke calmly and methodically, presenting his client as a man overwhelmed by the complexities of modern finance. Becker, now in his mid-50s, was described as someone whose glory days were behind him, but who still carried the expectations of a former world champion. Laidlaw said Becker's life had been shaped by fame since his teenage years, leaving him reliant on managers and advisors to handle his affairs. When the bankruptcy hit, he was emotionally and mentally unprepared to manage the legal consequences. He didn't intend to deceive, Laidlaw argued, but rather made poor decisions under immense stress. During his testimony, Becker himself took the stand. His voice was calm, but carried a tone of exhaustion. He spoke about the shock of learning he had been declared bankrupt. He insisted that he had been transparent and had handed over everything his lawyers and advisors had asked for. He explained that some of his assets were tied up in long-term investments or business ventures he no longer controlled. When asked about the missing trophies, Becker said he did not know where all of them were, claiming that some had been misplaced or were in the hands of past sponsors. "If I had them, I would have given them back," he said. His statement drew mixed reactions from the court. Some saw a man genuinely bewildered by his financial situation. Others saw a once powerful celebrity trying to talk his way out of accountability. Throughout the trial, small but significant details painted a clearer picture of Becker's financial collapse. Witnesses described how he had borrowed heavily to support his lifestyle, buying expensive properties and maintaining staff across several countries. His separation from Lily Becker had also been financially draining. Legal experts called by the prosecution explained how Becker had moved money between accounts to create confusion over what belonged to him and what didn't. One investigator said Becker had behaved like a man who didn't think the rules applied to them. Another described how Becker's cooperation with the bankruptcy trustees had been limited and delayed, making the process unnecessarily complicated. Outside the courtroom, the public followed the story closely. British newspapers ran daily updates with headlines like Becker's fall from grace and from Wimbledon to Wandsworth. In Germany, the coverage was more emotional. Many Germans still saw him as a national hero, a symbol of post-war success and determination. The idea that he could be facing jail time was difficult for fans to accept. Interviews with former players, coaches, and journalists filled television segments. Some defended Becker, saying fame had isolated him and made him vulnerable to poor advice. Others were less forgiving, pointing out that financial dishonesty, regardless of fame, demanded accountability. Back in court, the evidence kept building. The prosecution introduced records showing that Becker had failed to disclose a bank account in Belgium, where large transactions had taken place. They also pointed to emails and correspondence, suggesting that Becker was aware of his obligations, but chose to delay or omit key details. One email, read aloud in court, showed Becker telling an advisor that the less they know, the better, a line that the prosecution used to show his intent to conceal. Becker's lawyers tried to argue that the email was taken out of context, saying it referred to a business deal, not to the bankruptcy case. Still, it left a strong impression on the jury. As weeks turned into months, Becker's demeanor changed. He seemed quieter, more withdrawn. The confident posture of the former champion gave way to the uneasy patience of a man awaiting judgment. The courtroom atmosphere often felt tense, especially during cross-examinations. At one point, when asked about the transfers to his ex-wife and other family members, Becker became emotional. He explained that he was simply supporting his loved ones and not trying to hide money. "I was not trying to cheat anyone," he said. "I was trying to survive." His voice broke slightly, and for a moment, the courtroom was silent. But emotion could not erase the facts. Financial investigators continued to testify, presenting spreadsheets, transaction logs, and communication records. They described a pattern of concealment that was too detailed to be accidental. The judge listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions. The jury, composed of ordinary citizens, had the difficult task of deciding whether Becker's actions were the result of confusion or calculated deceit. The prosecution argued that Becker was a man used to winning, who believed his fame could protect him from the consequences of dishonesty. The defense countered that Becker was not a criminal mastermind, but a fallen sportsman trying to navigate a legal system he didn't fully understand. The trial also revealed how far Becker's life had drifted from the discipline that once defined him. Former colleagues spoke about his brilliance on the court, his focus and determination, but also about how fame had changed him. His wealth brought comfort, but also chaos. Lavish spending, poor investments, and a circle of advisors whose loyalty was often uncertain. When his fortune began to crumble, Becker was left exposed. The pressure to maintain an image of success made him take risks that would later destroy him. What began as financial mismanagement evolved into criminal behavior, or at least the appearance of it. As the trial neared its end, Becker's team tried to appeal to the jury's sense of empathy. They reminded the court that Becker's achievements had inspired millions, that his mistakes were not unique in the world of fallen celebrities. They painted him as a man who had lost his way, not one who set out to deceive. But the prosecution refused to soften. They argued that Becker's fame was exactly why accountability mattered. No one is above the law, Chalkley told the jury in her closing statement. Mr. Becker's accomplishments do not excuse his actions. They make them more disappointing. Outside the courthouse, the press waited every day to capture his arrival and departure. Becker, usually dressed in dark suits, walked past cameras with quiet dignity. He didn't answer reporters' questions, only nodding politely. His face, once familiar from victory celebrations, now carried the weight of years of pressure, loss, and public scrutiny. His family supported him privately, but the strain was visible. The once fearless champion seemed to be fighting his toughest match yet, not against an opponent on grass or clay, but against the consequences of his own choices. When the jury finally retired to consider their verdict, Becker sat silently. The world watched again, as it once did when he lifted his first Wimbledon trophy, but this time for very different reasons. The tension was heavy. It had taken years for the investigation to reach this moment, and the outcome would decide whether Boris Becker, the tennis hero turned bankrupt businessman, would regain some dignity or face the harsh reality of prison. The next step would seal his fate, and with it his legacy. When the jury returned to deliver its verdict in April 2022, the courtroom fell silent. After weeks of evidence, arguments, and emotional testimony, 12 jurors had reached their decision. Boris Becker, once the pride of Germany and a global tennis icon, was found guilty on 4 charges under the UK Insolvency Act. The counts included hiding assets, removing property, and failing to disclose key financial information during his bankruptcy proceedings. He was acquitted of some charges, but the convictions were enough to seal his downfall. The verdict confirmed what many had feared. Becker had crossed the line from financial mismanagement into criminal dishonesty. The announcement shook the sports world. News channels across Europe interrupted programming to broadcast the result. Outside the Southern Crown Court, cameras flashed as Becker walked out, pale and visibly shaken. The man who once commanded Wimbledon crowds with poise now faced the prospect of losing his freedom. Inside the courtroom, Judge Deborah Taylor described Becker's actions as deliberate and damaging. She said he had shown no humility and failed to appreciate the seriousness of his crimes. In her view, Becker had misled those trying to help him, choosing deception instead of cooperation. His reputation, she noted, had been forever tarnished by his conduct. Days later, Becker returned to court for sentencing. The atmosphere was tense but subdued. His lawyers appealed for leniency, arguing that he had already suffered enough through public humiliation and financial ruin. They stressed that he had not lived a life of luxury since the bankruptcy, and that imprisonment would destroy any chance of rebuilding his life. Becker himself did not make a long statement. He simply said he regretted what had happened and wished to make amends. But Judge Taylor remained firm. She acknowledged his contributions to sport, but made it clear that fame could not excuse wrongdoing. Becker was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison, with the possibility of release after serving half the term. The sentence sent ripples through both the sporting and legal communities. For many, it symbolized the equal reach of justice, proof that even those who once stood on top of the world could be held accountable. Becker, 54 at the time, was taken into custody immediately. He was first sent to Wandsworth Prison, a harsh Victorian-era facility in southwest London known for its crowded conditions. It was a dramatic contrast to the luxury and fame that had defined much of his life. Reports from inside suggested that Becker kept to himself, spending his days quietly and trying to adapt. Later, he was transferred to Huntercombe Prison, a lower security facility for foreign nationals. There, he reportedly began teaching sports to fellow inmates, sharing fitness routines, and helping with English lessons. Back in Germany, the news struck an emotional chord. Many people still remembered the young red-headed teenager who had made history on center court, and seeing him behind bars felt almost surreal. Former players and commentators reflected on how fame had shaped his life. Some said Becker's arrogance and unwillingness to listen had led to his fall. Others saw him as a victim of his own success, someone who rose too fast, surrounded by advisors more interested in his money than his well-being. Regardless of opinion, everyone agreed the story was tragic. The boy who had once inspired a generation had become a cautionary tale about excess and denial. Becker's imprisonment lasted about 8 months. In December 2022, he was released early under the UK's fast-track deportation scheme for foreign offenders. He was flown back to Germany, barred from returning to Britain. Cameras caught him arriving in Munich, thinner but composed, wearing a simple jacket instead of designer suits. Speaking later in interviews, Becker said prison had been the hardest experience of his life. He admitted he had made mistakes, but insisted that some media reports exaggerated his actions. He described the time behind bars as humbling and educational, claiming it had forced him to confront his past and rebuild from the ground up. After his return, Becker began appearing on German television again, mostly in interviews reflecting on his experiences. He said he planned to focus on coaching and commentary, staying away from risky business ventures. His tone was different, calmer, more measured. While he still had supporters, public opinion remained divided. Some believed his remorse was genuine. Others saw it as an attempt to repair a broken image. Yet, one thing was clear. The man who once defined power and control on the tennis court had been transformed by failure. The story of Boris Becker's bankruptcy and conviction is more than a legal drama. It's a human story about pride, pressure, and the cost of ignoring reality. It shows how success can distort judgment, how fame can isolate, and how denial can lead even the strongest to self-destruction. His fall from glory was not caused by a single mistake, but by years of living beyond limits, both financial and personal. In the end, Becker's name, once linked to victory and national pride, became a symbol of how quickly fortune can fade when truth is buried. His journey from Wimbledon champion to convicted felon remains one of the most striking examples of how triumph and tragedy can coexist in the same life.